management skills or data skills, basically, and with active internet connections who weren't in the eye of the storm, how could we be helping, you know, especially given so many new tools and something like compared to, you know, Hurricane Katrina. And so that's when I first became aware of the Standby Task Force, which is just standbytaskforce.org. They have a website, but it's not as up-to-date as what they're doing. But like, you know, like all volunteerish organizations, or even some non-volunteer organizations, what they do, and again, I'm not an official spokesperson, but I was given some clearance to talk informally. You know, they do things like try and build crisis maps, do assessments of infrastructure, especially when any kind of agency, in the most recent case, FEMA or the Coast Guard, says, you know, we could really use some volunteers on X. So I went through a process where you fill out a Google form, and I guess, you know, they just vet you slightly to make sure that you sound like you could be helpful, and I don't know the criteria for vetting. Make sure that they've got your contact info. Excuse me. And then following that, you're added to their Slack channel. And then there's also a legacy Ning site. I never knew how to say that. The Ning site nominally keeps track of who the members are, and it's the place where they have their training. And every member is required to go through basically 2 PowerPoint presentations that then have quizzes at the end. And the first one for people, the types of people on this call, is a little excruciating, but it's just to level set. You know, they try to make sure that you understand how to use Google for, you know, finding relevant info. And so you run through things like, you know, find 3 hospitals in this city in the Philippines, that kind of stuff. And then the second course is more on level setting on really basic GIS mapping, and mapping is probably even too strong a word, but, you know, making sure that people understand how to use decimal coordinates and, you know, different cross-reference tools, OpenStreetMaps, et cetera. And so that, you know, I thought that was useful and interesting. Once you've passed those and you're ready for your first deployment, they, you know, have email lists. I believe they do this through Ning, but you get notified through email. And what they do is they say, okay, we've got a deployment that's going to start at this date and time. Here's a sign-up sheet. And then you really, how the work works, and I did this for Irma, is you hang out in the Slack channel and you work through shared Google spreadsheets. The basic work for something like Irma can be trying to figure out which hashtags and keywords people are using, including misspellings. I know I found tons of stuff that was IMRA. And, you know, trying to monitor for things that might be difficult unless you had, you know, I don't know, some social media analytics engine with machine learning, trying to do the stuff that, you know, is quicker with a human on that time scale. So that was the deployment I worked on. There have been actually a lot of what they call deployments related to Irma. There's one ongoing right now for helping FEMA to assess the road infrastructure in Puerto Rico, and it can involve going through satellite imagery and FEMA's public tool for denoting if, I guess I'm not on this deployment, but I did see what the tool looks like for buildings, and you just have a few simple options: totally destroyed, minimal damage, looks fine. And then that helps them to bin things for, what to check on first, or, integrate with other data sources. With Irma's work for the Coast Guard, what we were ultimately looking for was finding people who were using social media, namely Twitter, to reach out for, 911 is busy, I'm not getting through, and then to include those on a map with some severity indications, primarily for people who are actively in danger, so that could be given to the Coast Guard to motor over and help people. But also things like down power lines. I do really think these kind of volunteer services are helpful and needed. I was frustrated at times thinking if I could just take some of these larger projects that I work on in my research life and put them into this volunteer space, we could be a lot more efficient. But, that'll take time, of course. So I felt like rather than doing searches, I wish I was, writing Python. But, I guess there's only so many hours in the day. So that's really the recap. If you'd like to sign up to be part of the Standby Task Force, go to standbytaskforce.org, and you should find the links. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
This is Leah Shanley. I've been deeply embedded. Actually, my prior life at the Wilson Center was working with these groups, including Standby Task Force, Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team, Crisis Commons, Humanity Road, and a variety of other virtual operation support teams. There's a whole host of these volunteer groups out there that harness the crowd. All of them are mobilizing very actively for the response for Harvey, for Irma, for the earthquake in Mexico, for flooding in India. I'm about to send out a link to the Crowd in the Cloud, which is a PBS TV series on crowdsourcing. They have very kindly aggregated a lot of these links to these different groups on their homepage right now, so you can go and check that out. I really like Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team because I think they've been very rigorous in their mobilizing the mapping community and trying to ensure high data quality. There's also a project on the Zooniverse that is doing satellite image interpretation to the crowd. I'm a little cautious of Digital Globe's TomNod. They've had some ethical issues with that, but they still could potentially have some good applications there to check out. Sophia Liu from the U.S. Geological Survey, who's their innovation officer and also helps to run the federal community on crowdsourcing now, has been mobilizing people. She sent me an invitation. We probably could forward it. They're having a tag up or stand up every day at 4 for those who want to help FEMA in this kind of crowdsourcing activity. So again, if you're interested, let us know. We'll connect you to Sophia.
And you reminded me of one thing I didn't mention that someone, especially like Andrew, might be interested in is one group that you can volunteer with within Standby Task Force is to be on, and of course I'm not going to get the name right of this group, but I think it's like the empathy team or the compassion team. And it is really hard when you're going through lots of messages from desperate people, seeing pictures of things that aren't going to be fixed anytime soon. I didn't partake of that, but I thought it was a neat and necessary component that they do have people devoted to showing the volunteers pictures of babies and puppies and general just talking it out, because it's hard work for sure.
Well, and yeah, and that's definitely been a topic the last several years, is because you can get burnout from that. Another thing to consider is GIS Corps takes people with deep technical skills. So their requirement to volunteer for them is that you've had at least 5 years of GIS remote sensing or data science experience. And they do very targeted mobilization. So they get activated by the United Nations, World Bank, USAID, other response organizations. They work very closely with those organizations. And their volunteers not only work remotely, but often go on site to help out with the response efforts. So that's another group to look towards if you're looking for more active engagement in this response and have the technical skills. I also believe Code for America, I should mention, was looking for programmers to help out, particularly on APIs, to create interactive maps and things for people on, where they could find food or shelter or medical care, et cetera.
Well, that's great. I actually, in listening to a lot of that, there's some connections, I think, here with some of what I was going to talk about that was done here at the Texas Advanced Computing Center when Harvey was taking place in Houston and the rest of the Gulf. And so a lot of the work that we do here is simulation and model driven. And so, people would sort of expect some of the things that we'd be doing would be running, large weather codes in order to do more accurate predictions of the storms, and certainly there were people doing that here at the center. We have other folks who are doing more sort of flood and coastal flooding simulations based on both measured and projected forecasting. And that was sort of the interesting part that we had here, because Dr. David Maidment here, who is the Center for Water Research, was called by the Texas Task Force 1 folks, who are the other folks who are sending people out into the field to go do, search and rescue, recovery, and assessing damages and all those sort of things in the area. And the folks that were actually steering that were doing things based mostly on what I sort of call the seat of their pants sort of thing, which was difficult when you had a storm the size of Harvey coming on board. Which we'd never seen before. It was also complicated by the fact that, the terrain is fairly flat. We really didn't know that people didn't know what was flooded, what wasn't, and how to react to this while the storm was going on. So we got a call very quickly from them to get started, just starting almost from nothing on a Friday afternoon, to spinning things up here so that we could go ahead and do a full-scale modeling and simulation run, at least, of what the flood inundation was going to be, or had been and was going to be, and how it was going to recede, to at least get the information to them in a nice GIS format that they could do both decision-making at sort of a large level, but then also starting to disseminate that information out to the responders in the field. So really sort of, take everything from a high-level map down to almost a building-by-building prediction and projection on those things. It's the first time it was tried, and we had, success in a lot of ways. It was good for them to just have data. The accuracy of it was a little, I would say it wasn't perfect, but it was a lot better than having absolutely nothing besides, people driving down the road and then pointing out where things were flooded or what bridges were down. So, it was a successful project that we had going through that. And we hope to continue expanding that and refining the national water model at some level to give us a more accurate basis for predicting storm surges and river flooding during storms like Harvey. We also really it was a key thing for me, at least, because my sister is part of the Texas Task Force 1. She has those search and rescue dogs. And, really being able to get the information quickly out to people in that period of time is very important. And so that's one of the things that I hope that, not just TACC, but other centers will be able to do. And we can, refine all of this and moving forward and hopefully can save some lives here. So that's sort of my little lightning talk about what we did for Harvey here. But I would be really interested to start taking some of these citizen science or citizen disaster measurement folks and couple them in with some of this modeling so that we can start doing verification, validation of these things and improving the fidelity of all of the sort of data that we can assimilate, both simulated and observed in these crisis situations.
Have you seen a website called NC-SARA?
No, I haven't.
It's interesting. So, NC's been dealing with some of these same issues. Now, we don't run the national water model. We don't. What we do, we run ADSUR quite a bit here, and for storms, which is a storm surge prediction code, and it does it will do inundation. It will do inundation up the river channels too, but it lacks as far as I understand, which I'm not sure, it lacks integration with the water model itself, you know, the inland flooding stuff. And so, well, this website called NC-SARA is, I can't remember where it's done from, but the model runs happen here, and I think it's at LSU that the website is actually stored. And they have, you know, pretty detailed way of presenting the information from the model runs. And what would be, and they have some way of, I believe they have some way of distributing it already to first responders. Mm-hmm. So it might be instructive at least to have a look.
No, absolutely. I know, I mean, I didn't mention it directly, but Clint Dawson here at UT has been doing storm surge modeling.
Yeah. So the people here like Rick Ludick and Johannes Westering, who's at Notre Dame, and Brian Blanton, who's here. I mean, Rick is the director of UNC Marine Sciences, but he also has a joint appointment at Renzi.
And I know there was sort of interest in that. I'm sorry, feedback here. So there was interest here in trying to, you know, most of these inundation models, at least from the coastal flooding storm surge, are very localized scenes. You know, you do Galveston Bay, you do, you know, Corpus Christi, but actually, you know, expanding that and getting the sort of edge conditions and all of the different, you know, going up to a larger scale is sort of the next big thing I know that they're working to do.
It is a pretty large grid in NC-SARA. I mean, it's an East Coast, and I don't know that it goes around into the Gulf, but it's several million nodes. I mean, it's not a small grid.
Oh yeah, no, it's not a small grid, but it's the actual how refined they are in those areas and
right.
What
the areas of interest. Sure. Yeah.
So this is Leah. For the last 9 months, Carl and I have organized a series of informal calls. We haven't advertised it to the whole hub, but the group is growing. That includes Rick and Larry Band and John Goodall, Jared Bales from COASI, the USGS water data science team, and several others to scope out what are the water data science challenges to downscaling the national water model to the local level or regional level, and particularly connecting the coastal estuary with the inland. So if there are folks on this phone that are interested in that, I'm planning to sponsor a small working meeting once we kind of scope out the you know, parameters of it sometime in the early 2018.
So John is at Virginia?
Yeah, he's at UVA.
Yeah. So we did a proposal with he and a guy named Chris Duffy.
Yeah, at NASA.
No, well, he wasn't at Penn State. I think.
Oh, Penn State.
I think Chris is retired actually.
Okay.
So this was 2 years ago. We did a proposal. It was with the data bridge and the national water. Through the DIBS project. So I don't know, Raja and or I might be interested still in that group if possible.
Hi, Lee. I know some in the West Hub here who would be interested.
Okay,
and,
you connect us.
Yeah, and Niall, your comments reminded me where the San Diego Supercomputer Center has really put a lot of emphasis is in wildfire response, which we, of course, have as much as others have hurricane activity. And so the big project there, which I know you know about, but for others, is Y-Fire, W-I-Fire, like wildfire. And through that project and through that area, we've become a part of what's emerged as urgent computing as a field. And I believe 2 years ago we hosted a workshop on this, but they have it annually as part of the ICCS, which is the International Conference on Computational Science. And what the urgent computing group looks at is how to be responsive, you know, when speed is more important than getting to an exactly perfect answer, you know, as Niall was describing.
Absolutely, and that was sort of, it was very different for a lot of people in the academic crowds, that's for sure. You know, we're not used to, I think, working in that way, but it was, I'd be interested to see how that's going.
Well, and what we learned from working with firefighters, and this isn't something I learned, but Ilkay Altintas, who's the PI in many of these projects, you know, she describes that what they want to be able to do is tell the person on the ground, go right or go left, and it's not more complicated than that. And so, yes, it's a very hard thing for an academic to distill to a very, very simple binary answer, but that is what our first responders need.
Well, I mean, there has been a lot of work, I think, in decision support in the first responder context in the last few years. I mean, so I don't think we're totally unaware of it.
Oh yeah, not just seeing anyone on this call, just that it can be hard with, we're used to, you know, spending months on, you know, double checking, rechecking, rigorously writing things up in papers, to instead give out what we feel might be kind of a flaky answer, but is good enough for the right or left scenario.
Yeah, and better than no answer, as long as it's timely.
Right.
Exactly. And that was, yeah, that was a challenge. And yeah, and the computationally with the fires, what are they doing? I mean, is it really just doing GIS overlays so that people can decide where to put resources, or?
Well, it's a data integration problem where they're looking at topography, weather conditions, fuel, and then trying to figure out where the fire line should be established and where things might go in the next several hours that would change how resources are deployed.
That's very cool.
And this is John. Leah might have answered this. That in the past 10 minutes, I've kind of heard this extraordinary patchwork of efforts that all feel kind of separate. It is, in fact, on the ground when a disaster happens, does this all come together seamlessly, and there's people who know how to coordinate it all, or is it kind of more of a collision of sometimes happy or unhappy accidents when the resources show up?
Well, at least for the Wi-Fi project, which is reasonably well-funded and has, you know, supported connections like with the Los Angeles Fire Department and local CAL FIRE in our state, it does work. Even for things that aren't making, you know, the headlines in all of our West Coast papers, you know, they are working together operationally very often. For other efforts, I can't speak to that. They do. I know the one I was part of, you have a core group of people who are regular volunteers, and they seem to kind of hum along, and the new people, you know, struggle to be useful. But the standby task force seems to have a model that's well honed. It's not always the right tool for the hurricane, because as we saw with Irma, the cell towers were knocked out in the Caribbean, and so those people certainly would have liked to be getting our, you know, having us get their messages, but they just weren't able to send any.
Yeah, so this was a bit of a Wild West. A lot of this initiated in 2010 after the Haiti earthquake. It's actually when Standby Task Force first emerged. And so these groups were very much, you get on these Skype calls and there'd be 200 people or more with no actual leader. But over time, the groups have really begun to professionalize, as you say, the core group of volunteers and the leadership. And one of my roles back at the Wilson Center was to help these groups form nonprofits with governance boards and sustain funding and connect them with the formal response organizations. And one thing that UN OCHA, which is the Office of Humanitarian Affairs or Humanitarian Coordination, work to do is they did a really nice kind of information needs assessment. One, looking at decision makers in emergency response, both back office and kind of boots in the field. What kind of information did they need? When did they need it? And what form did they need it to make decisions? And then how do we help the crowdsourced volunteers to produce those kinds of information? So it's not just a mad data scramble, which is what it was initially. And on the flip side, they also created guidebooks on, okay, if you're an emergency responder, how do I work with digital volunteer groups? Because what you have is a very hierarchical, formal response organization and a very flat, distributed, organic, crowdsourced information. So kind of organizationally, how do we develop durable workflows across these? I'd say there's still experimentation and research to be done, but we are at least 7 years in now and see a lot more formalization and a lot more transfer, technology transfer of the knowledge that the digital volunteers experimented with and developed into the research community, and now transfer over to the professional responders. And often those volunteers are also responders in their day jobs. So you see this intermingling of expertise. So just because it's a volunteer doesn't mean it's not someone with deep expertise in their area. And they were setting up, in some instances, areas called virtual operation support teams, or VOS. And this was particularly in the Southwest where we had fires. So those are trained individuals, often responders in their day jobs, or people who are highly trained that volunteer their time, and they create a trusted cadre so that they have a close working relationship with the emergency response organization. When a disaster happens, there's already a well-coordinated response.
Can I ask a question? Have people been thinking a lot about how these kind of efforts proceed in a situation like Puerto Rico, where they're really, you're not going to get much local data because the electrical grid and the cell grid are gone, but presumably there's still satellites flying over.
Yes, that's exactly right. So satellite mapping. So that's what the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team does specifically. And in fact, with Haiti, they were able to map the damage to Haiti was in a matter of days. That took the Army Corps of Engineers 3 weeks, and they have a live video that you can see all the nodes that were added.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, they have a tiling system in place. So they tile the imagery to small chunks. A volunteer will check out a piece of that imagery, do the digitization. There's some overlap, like having maybe 2 or 3 volunteers do the same place. They have a seasoned volunteer maybe do the checking, so there's some quality control procedures, and then you check it back in, and you have all the volunteers. Suddenly you've created that mosaic but they do it in they now have a really well-developed workflow system that allows you to check in and check out at these different points. And
do they have also a way to advertise and export that data so that things like what Nigel was talking about, the national water model would have, okay, here's the data. I mean, we can get our hands on it. We can put it into our models. I mean, is there some integration between all this? Or
so that's actually the subject of the spoke proposal that was submitted by Kawasi and John Goodall.
Okay.
So how do we integrate citizen
science? It's a reasonable question.
Yeah, it's a reasonable question. So I don't know if they'll get funded, but it was definitely, Kawasi is interested in serving as a repository for crowdsourced data and how to integrate it with the data that they traditionally keep. And what are the data quality issues they have to consider. So maybe we could get John and Jared to come talk about it at the next meeting.
Yeah, it's an interesting question.
Yep.
And this is Christine. To that point, exactly, the Standby Task Force just had a deployment for doing just what Leah described with the tiled images for road conditions, and I'll paste the example map that was generated. Hopefully it won't prompt you for a login. You can click around and avoid that, but that'll give you an example of how this data looks when it's kind of in its final usable form.
Well, and along those lines, the other thing that might be of some interest, we're part of the Design Safe project, which is a natural hazards civil engineering. It's the old and Harry project is what it is. But they built up a rather nice portal that allows you to bring in data, share data, and then compute on things. Largely, this is going to be, initially it's coming in from the different labs that are doing, water, wave experiments and shake tables and all those sort of things. But we did wind up putting some of the data in there for people to look at, and it gives a nice infrastructure for people to, work on different data that's been, fairly well curated, at least it's tagged, and, allows people to just get the resources they need and hopefully discover and put these things together. So